Have you ever wondered why certain military operations during World War II succeeded against all odds, defying every mathematical probability, every strategic analysis, every prediction made by the finest military minds of the era? What if the secret weapon that turned the tide of the deadliest conflict in human history was not a bomb, not a tank, not a breakthrough in radar technology, but something far more ancient, far more powerful, and far more terrifying than anything the modern world was prepared to understand? Before I reveal what has been hidden from you for over 80 years, I need your help. Comment below and tell me where you are watching from right now. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please take a moment to do so. We need your support to continue uncovering these secrets that powerful institutions have fought desperately to keep buried. Subscribe now and become part of this mission. The official history books will tell you that the Apache code talkers were a small group of Native American soldiers who used their indigenous language to transmit coded messages during World War II. They will tell you that their contribution, while valuable, was limited compared to their more famous Navajo counterparts. They will tell you that after the war, these men returned to their reservations, lived quiet lives, and took their secrets to their graves. The official history books are lying to you. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. January 1942. The winter wind cut across the plains like a blade forged from pure malice, carrying with it the kind of cold that seemed personal, that found every gap in clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Second Lieutenant William Strongbow stood at attention in an office that smelled of cigarette smoke, old paper, and something else. Something that reminded him of the sage his grandmother used to burn during ceremonies he was forbidden to attend after the age of 12. The man behind the desk wore the uniform of a full colonel, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They were too still, too focused, like the eyes of a predator that had learned to wear human skin. His name, according to the placard on his desk, was Colonel Marcus Henley, but William would later learn that this was only the most recent in a long series of names this particular individual had worn over the centuries. "Lieutenant Strongbow," the colonel said, his voice carrying an accent that did not belong to any region William could identify. "Do you know why you have been summoned here today?" William knew better than to speculate. He had learned, during his 3 months in the Army, that officers preferred simple answers to complex questions. "No, sir," he replied. The colonel smiled, and William felt something cold move through his chest, something that had nothing to do with the January weather. "You have been selected for a special program, a program that does not officially exist, a program that, if you complete it successfully, will never appear on any service record, any commendation, any historical account of this war. You will receive no medals for what you are about to do, no parades, no recognition, and if you fail, your family will be told that you died in a training accident. Your body will never be recovered." William maintained his composure, though his heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear of combat. He had grown up on the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico, raised by a grandmother who had survived the long walk, who had preserved traditions and knowledge that the boarding schools had tried to beat out of 3 generations of her people. She had told him stories, late at night when the government agents were not watching, stories about the old ways, about the warriors who could walk between worlds, about enemies that wore human faces but were not human at all. He had dismissed those stories as the fantasies of an old woman clinging to a dying culture. Standing in that office, looking into Colonel Henley's 2 still eyes, he began to reconsider. The program was officially designated Project Wind Talker, though among those who knew its true purpose, it was called something else entirely. William was transported, along with 17 other Apache men, selected from various military installations across the Southwest, to a facility in the Arizona desert that appeared on no maps. The buildings were old, adobe structures that could have been built yesterday or 500 years ago. The instructors were a mixture of military personnel and civilians, including several elderly Apache men and women who wore traditional clothing and spoke in dialects that William had only heard fragments of during his childhood. The first week was dedicated to what the instructors called baseline assessment. The recruits were subjected to a battery of tests unlike anything William had encountered in basic training. They were asked to describe their dreams in exhaustive detail. They were shown photographs of people they had never met and asked what they felt when looking at each face. They were placed in darkened rooms and asked to describe what they sensed around them. They were given bitter herbs to drink that induced visions, and those visions were recorded by scribes who wrote in notebooks that were immediately locked away. By the end of the first week, 5 of the 18 recruits had been returned to their original units with no memory of where they had been or what they had experienced. William later learned that these men had failed some crucial test, had lacked some essential quality that the program required. He never learned what happened to the 3 who had been taken away in the night, their bunks empty when morning came, their names never spoken again. The 13 who remained were gathered in a kiva, a circular underground chamber that William recognized from his grandmother's descriptions, though he had never seen one intact. The walls were covered with paintings that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, depicting scenes of warfare that spanned millennia. Apache warriors on horseback charging against Spanish conquistadors, Mescalero scouts guiding American cavalry through terrain that should have been impassable, and older images still, figures in ceremonial dress facing creatures that had too many limbs, too many eyes, shapes that hurt to look at directly. One of the elderly Apache instructors, a woman named Ishtane, who claimed to be 107 years old, though she moved with the fluidity of someone half that age, addressed them in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have been chosen," she said, "because you carry the blood of those who fought the Long War, not the wars that the white man records in his books, not the wars over land and gold and pride. The Long War has been fought since the first people emerged from the underworld. It is a war against enemies that do not die, that cannot be killed with bullets or blades, that feed on the suffering of nations." William exchanged glances with the man beside him, a Chiricahua Apache named Thomas Greyfeather, who had been a ranch hand in Texas before enlisting. Thomas's expression suggested he was thinking the same thing William was thinking, that they had been recruited into some kind of elaborate hoax, or perhaps a psychological experiment designed to test their mental stability under stress. Ishtane seemed to read their skepticism. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect for a woman of her claimed age. "You doubt," she said. "Good. Doubt is the first defense against the enemy. They cannot enter a mind that questions. They cannot possess a spirit that thinks for itself. But doubt must eventually yield to knowledge, or it becomes its own form of blindness." She raised her hand, and the torches in the kiva dimmed until the only light came from her palm, a soft blue glow that cast no shadows and seemed to illuminate things that were not visible in normal light. William saw, for just a moment, shapes moving at the edges of the chamber, tall and thin and wrong in ways his mind refused to process. He heard whispers in a language that predated all human speech, felt a pressure against his consciousness like fingers probing for a way inside. Then the torches flared back to full brightness, and everything was normal again. Except that William knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that nothing would ever be normal again. The training that followed was unlike anything the United States Army had ever sanctioned. In the mornings, the recruits learned conventional military skills, weapons handling, hand-to-hand combat, radio operation, the basics of codes and ciphers. In the afternoons, they studied the Apache language, not the simplified version that had been preserved on the reservations, but an older form, a ceremonial dialect that contained words for concepts that English could not express. In the evenings, they were taught to see. Seeing, as Ishtane explained it, was not a matter of vision, but of perception. The human mind, she said, was like a radio receiver that had been tuned to only a narrow band of frequencies. Most people went through their entire lives hearing only static, occasionally catching fragments of signals they dismissed as imagination or coincidence. But the mind could be trained to tune to other frequencies, to perceive layers of reality that existed alongside the physical world like pages in a book. The enemy, she said, existed primarily on these other frequencies. They had learned, over millennia of interaction with humanity, how to influence the physical world indirectly, how to whisper suggestions into receptive minds, how to amplify emotions of fear and hatred and despair until those emotions took on a life of their own. They could not be fought with conventional weapons, but they could be perceived, tracked, and their influence countered by those who knew how. The Apache code talkers, the real code talkers, would serve a dual purpose in the war. On the surface, they would transmit military communications in an unbreakable code, just as the official history would later record. But their true mission was to scan the frequencies of the spirit world, to identify where the enemy was concentrating its efforts, and to relay that information to a network of individuals scattered throughout the Allied forces who had the knowledge and ability to respond. William progressed through the training faster than most of his peers. Ishtane told him that his grandmother had prepared him well, even if he had not understood the purpose of her teachings at the time. The stories she had told, the fragments of ceremony she had preserved, the way she had trained him to always be aware of his surroundings, to notice things that others overlooked, all of these had laid a foundation that the program could build upon. By March of 1942, William could see the edges of the other frequencies. He described it later in his private journal as like wearing glasses for the first time after a lifetime of poor vision. The world looked the same, but there were details he had never noticed before. The way shadows moved independently of their sources in places where the enemy's influence was strong. The subtle wrongness in the expressions of people who had been compromised, who were being used as conduits for whispers they did not consciously hear. The cold spots in rooms and landscapes where the barrier between frequencies was thin. He also learned about the enemy's particular interest in the war that was consuming the world. Large-scale human conflict, Ishtane explained, generates enormous amounts of psychic energy. Fear, hatred, grief, despair, the death agonies of millions. This energy is what the enemy feeds upon. They have been cultivating humanity for this purpose since before your ancestors crossed the land bridge from Asia. Every war is a harvest. This war, the one the white man calls World War II, is the largest harvest in human history. She showed them maps that did not depict countries or battle lines, but flows of psychic energy, concentrations of enemy activity, points where the barrier between frequencies had been deliberately weakened to allow easier feeding. Europe was almost entirely dark on these maps, a swirling vortex of negative energy centered on Germany and spreading outward like an infection. The Pacific was spotted with smaller but equally intense concentrations, each one corresponding to a major battle or atrocity. The enemy, Ishtane continued, does not care which side wins your war. They feed equally on the suffering of all humans. But they have learned that certain individuals, certain ideologies, generate more of the energy they crave. They have been whispering in the ears of the powerful for decades, cultivating leaders who will maximize human misery. She named names. Some of them William recognized from newspapers and radio broadcasts. Others were new to him, businessmen and politicians and military officers who operated behind the scenes, amplifying the worst impulses of the famous figures who served as their puppets. She explained how the enemy had been systematically undermining attempts at peace since the end of the First World War. how they had sabotaged diplomatic efforts, assassinated moderates, and inflamed nationalist sentiments across the globe. And she explained what the Apache code talkers were expected to do about it. "You cannot stop the war," she said. "The momentum is too great, the enemy's influence too deeply embedded. Millions will die, regardless of what you do. But you can reduce the harvest. You can identify where the enemy is concentrating its efforts and alert those who can disrupt their operations. You can shield the minds of soldiers and commanders who might otherwise be driven to commit atrocities. You can save souls, even if you cannot save lives." In April of 1942, William Strongbow and the 12 other graduates of the first Apache Code Talker class were deployed to various theaters of operation. William was assigned to the Pacific, specifically to a unit that would participate in the campaigns across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and eventually the Philippines. His official role was communications specialist, transmitting and receiving messages in the Apache language that Japanese code breakers would never decipher. His unofficial role was to scan the frequencies, report enemy activity, and protect the minds of the men around him from influences they could not perceive. He was also given a contact list, memorized and never written down, of other individuals throughout the Allied forces who had been trained in similar disciplines. Some were Native Americans from other programs based on Navajo, Choctaw, and Comanche traditions. Others came from completely different backgrounds: Tibetan monks who had fled the Japanese invasion of China, practitioners of Vodou from Haiti and New Orleans, descendants of European cunning folk who had preserved their knowledge through centuries of persecution. They formed a hidden network, communicating through coded phrases embedded in official correspondence, watching the frequencies, countering the enemy wherever they could. William's first combat experience came on Guadalcanal, that blood-soaked island where American and Japanese forces clashed for 6 months, in conditions that seemed designed by malevolent gods to maximize human suffering. The jungle heat, the constant rain, the diseases that killed as many men as bullets, the isolation and terror of night attacks when enemies emerged from the darkness like demons from a fever dream. And there were actual demons, William learned, or something close enough that the distinction did not matter. He saw them for the first time during a night patrol in early September. His squad was moving through jungle so dense that they could barely see the man in front of them, following a trail that intelligence claimed led to a Japanese supply depot. William was in the middle of the formation, his radio equipment on his back, his rifle in his hands, his perception split between the physical world and the frequencies he had been trained to monitor. The attack came without warning, as Japanese attacks always did on Guadalcanal. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, the crack of Arisaka rifles, the screams of men on both sides as bullets found flesh. William threw himself behind a fallen tree, returning fire at shapes he could barely see, his training taking over while his conscious mind tried to process the chaos. And then he saw it, hovering above the battle, visible only on the frequencies that most humans could not perceive, was something that defied description. It was not solid in any conventional sense, more like a disturbance in the fabric of reality, a concentration of wrongness that hurt to look at, even with non-physical eyes. It had no face, but William felt its attention, felt it feeding on the terror and pain that filled the jungle night, felt it reaching down with tendrils of influence to amplify the emotions of the combatants. He felt it notice him. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, William was paralyzed. The thing's attention was like a weight pressing against his mind, probing for weaknesses, looking for a way inside. He heard whispers in his thoughts, suggestions that were not his own, that his rifle should swing toward the American soldier beside him, that the man was secretly a coward who would abandon him at the first opportunity, that the Japanese were not really the enemy, that the real enemy was much closer, that the only way to survive was to eliminate threats before they could materialize. William did what Ishtane had taught him. He did not fight the Whispers directly. Fighting only fed them energy. Instead, he found the center of his being, the still point that existed beneath thought and emotion, and he sang. Not out loud, not in any way that his physical voice could produce, but on the frequencies where the battle was truly being fought. He sang a song his grandmother had taught him when he was 7 years old, a song about the dawn, about light returning after darkness, about the eternal cycle that no evil could ultimately break. The thing recoiled, not defeated, not destroyed, but momentarily pushed back, its attention diverted from the minds it had been influencing, and in that moment the chaos of the battle shifted. The Japanese assault, which had seemed on the verge of overwhelming the American patrol, faltered. Shots went wide that should have found their targets. A Japanese officer who had been screaming orders suddenly fell silent, clutching his head, as if in pain. The Americans rallied, found cover, began to organize a coherent defense. The firefight lasted another 20 minutes, but the worst was over. When dawn finally came, revealing the carnage of the night, William's squad had survived with only minor casualties. The Japanese had withdrawn, leaving behind their dead and a supply depot that intelligence had been correct about after all. None of his fellow soldiers knew what had really happened. They attributed their survival to luck, to training, to the incompetence of this particular Japanese unit. William did not correct them. He simply filed his after-action report, including the coded phrases that would alert the network to enemy activity in this sector, and prepared for the next patrol. Over the following months, as the campaign for Guadalcanal ground toward its bloody conclusion, William encountered the enemy many times. He learned to recognize the signs of their presence, the unnatural fog that descended on certain positions regardless of weather conditions, the epidemic of nightmares that swept through units stationed near ancient sites, the seemingly random acts of violence among soldiers who had no prior history of instability. He learned which battles were merely human affairs and which were being manipulated for maximum harvest. He also learned that he could not save everyone. The enemy was vast and ancient, and William was one man with training that amounted to barely a year of preparation against millennia of experience. There were nights when his songs were not enough, when the Whispers found their way into minds he was trying to protect, when good men did terrible things because something had crawled inside their thoughts and made those terrible things feel necessary. After one such night, when a corporal named Jenkins had murdered 3 sleeping soldiers before turning his weapon on himself, William retreated into the jungle to be alone with his grief and his failure. The corporal had been a gentle man, a schoolteacher from Vermont who wrote poetry in his spare time and cried when he talked about his young daughter back home. There had been no warning signs, no indication that the enemy had targeted him specifically. William had been focused on other threats, and the Whispers had found an unguarded mind. He was still sitting among the trees when Thomas Greyfeather found him. Thomas had been assigned to a different unit on Guadalcanal, but the network had ways of arranging meetings when they were needed. "You could not have saved him," Thomas said, settling beside William on the damp jungle floor. "The enemy chose him because he was kind. Kind people are easier to break. Their capacity for empathy becomes a weapon against them." William did not respond. He was remembering the corporal's face, the confusion and horror that had flooded his features in the seconds before he died, as if he had awakened from a nightmare only to find that the nightmare was real and irreversible. "Ishtane told me something before we deployed," Thomas continued. "She said that we would lose more battles than we won. She said that the best we could hope for was to reduce the harvest by small amounts, to save a few souls here and there, to plant seeds that might flower generations from now. She said that if we expected to see victory in our lifetimes, we would go mad with despair." "Then, what is the point?" William asked, his voice hollow. Why fight at all if we cannot win? Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that went beyond his years. Because every soul we save matters. Because the enemy wants us to believe that resistance is futile, that we should simply surrender to despair. Because our grandmothers and grandfathers fought this same war with even less hope than we have, and they did not give up. Because somewhere, in a future we will never see, the seeds we plant will grow into something that can end this forever. We fight because that is what we are. That is what we have always been. William looked at his friend, saw the gold flecks in his eyes that marked him as a seer, saw the weariness that came from carrying knowledge that most humans were spared. He nodded slowly and rose to his feet. There was a war to fight. Several wars, in fact, and giving up was not an option. The months that followed Guadalcanal tested William Strongbow in ways that no training could have prepared him for. He moved with the Allied forces across the Pacific, island by island, battle by battle, watching young men die in numbers that defied comprehension, while simultaneously fighting a war that those young men would never know existed. New Georgia, Bougainville, the Marshall Islands. Each campaign brought new horrors, both physical and spiritual. He learned to function on almost no sleep, because sleep brought vulnerability to the frequencies where the enemy hunted. He learned to eat when food was available regardless of appetite, because his body needed fuel even when his spirit felt hollow. He learned to smile and joke with his fellow soldiers, to maintain the illusion of normalcy, because morale mattered in ways that went beyond simple psychology. And he learned that the enemy was adapting. The first sign came during the assault on Saipan in June of 1944. William was attached to a Marine unit tasked with clearing a series of caves that Japanese forces had fortified into an almost impregnable defensive network. The caves of Saipan would become infamous in military history for the suicidal resistance of their defenders, for the mass civilian suicides that shocked even hardened combat veterans, for an intensity of fighting that seemed to exceed all rational military calculation. William knew why. He sensed the concentration of enemy presence before the first shots were fired. The island was saturated with it, a density of negative energy that exceeded anything he had encountered on Guadalcanal or anywhere else. It was as if the enemy had chosen Saipan as a focal point, had deliberately channeled their influence into this single location to maximize the harvest of suffering. But there was something else, something new. As William scanned the frequencies during the approach to the island, he detected patterns of organization that he had not seen before. The enemy had always operated in a somewhat chaotic manner, individual entities feeding opportunistically wherever suffering was available. On Saipan, they were coordinated. They were working together toward some specific goal that went beyond simple feeding. He reported his observations through the network, using coded phrases embedded in his routine communications. The response came within 48 hours, relayed through a Navy chaplain who was secretly a practitioner of an ancient Greek tradition that had survived the fall of the Byzantine Empire. The message was simple and chilling. They are building something. We do not know what, but they have been gathering energy for months, concentrating it in specific locations across the Pacific. Saipan is one of several focal points. Others include locations in the Philippines, in Okinawa, and in Japan itself. We believe they are preparing for something unprecedented. Gather what intelligence you can. Survive, if possible. The battle for Saipan lasted 3 weeks. William survived, though many times he was certain he would not. He watched Marines die in cave entrances that had been turned into killing fields. He watched Japanese soldiers charge into certain death with expressions of ecstasy that had nothing to do with military honor and everything to do with external influence. He watched civilians, women and children among them, throw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender. Their terror so amplified by whispers they could not hear that death seemed preferable to any alternative. and he watched the enemy feed. They were not subtle about it on Saipan. The concentration of entities was so dense that William could see them even without deliberately shifting his perception to the other frequencies. They hung over the battlefield like a storm cloud made of hunger, tendrils extending down to drink from the dying, from the grieving, from the minds breaking under pressures no human psyche was designed to endure. They were glutted, swollen, pulsing with stolen energy that they channeled away from the island toward destinations William could not determine. He tried to intervene. He sang the songs his grandmother had taught him, the songs Ishtane had refined and expanded during his training. He reached out to protect minds when he could, to disrupt the enemy's coordination when opportunities arose. But he was one man against a multitude, a single voice trying to be heard over a chorus of screams. By the time Saipan was declared secure, William had lost the ability to cry. Not from emotional numbness, though that would have been understandable. Something in the frequencies had shifted, had closed off the part of him that could release grief through tears. Ishtane had warned that this might happen, that prolonged exposure to the enemy's influence could change a seer in unpredictable ways. The hope was that such changes would be temporary. The fear was that they would not. The network convened a meeting in August of 1944. The first full gathering since deployment had scattered its members across the globe. The location was a hospital ship anchored off the coast of newly liberated Guam, where several network members had arranged to be transferred for treatment of various real and fabricated injuries. William arrived with a shrapnel wound in his left shoulder that had become infected, giving him a legitimate reason to be there. The meeting was held in a supply closet that had been warded against observation on all frequencies. 12 individuals were present, representing traditions from 4 continents. William recognized Thomas Greyfeather, who had survived campaigns in New Guinea that had reduced his unit to a quarter of its original strength. He recognized Maria Santos, a nurse from New Mexico who practiced a fusion of Catholic mysticism and indigenous knowledge that had been passed down through her family since the Spanish colonial period. He recognized others only from descriptions in coded messages, faces he had never seen attached to names he had memorized. The leader of the meeting was a British officer named Alistair Crown, no relation to the infamous occultist, though the similarity of names had caused him considerable annoyance over the years. Crown was 63 years old, a veteran of the First World War who had been recruited into this shadow conflict after witnessing something in the trenches of the Somme that no official history would ever record. His eyes held the same gold flecks as William's, though decades of service had added a weight to them that William hoped he would never have to bear. The situation is worse than we anticipated. Crown began without preamble. His accent was clipped, precise, the product of an English education that had trained him to deliver terrible news with minimal emotional display. Our colleagues in Europe have confirmed that the enemy's activities there are similarly coordinated. The concentration camps, the Eastern Front, the bombing campaigns on both sides, all of it is being harvested with unprecedented efficiency. Energy is being channeled to collection points that we have not been able to locate. What are they building? Maria asked. The question had been on everyone's mind since the first reports of unusual enemy behavior had begun circulating through the network. Crown was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tremor that William had never heard before. We believe they are attempting to breach the barrier between frequencies permanently, to create a doorway that will allow them direct access to the physical world, rather than the indirect influence they have exercised throughout human history. If they succeed, the feeding will no longer be limited to the energy generated by human suffering. They will be able to consume directly. Every living consciousness on Earth will become prey. The silence that followed was absolute. William felt something cold settle in his stomach, a fear that went beyond anything the physical war had produced in him. He thought of his grandmother, still living on the reservation in New Mexico, unaware that her grandson was fighting battles that made the ones in the newspapers look like children's games. He thought of everyone he had ever known, every stranger he had ever passed on the street, reduced to food for entities that had been preparing this moment since before humanity could write. "How do we stop them?" Thomas asked finally. Crown shook his head slowly. "We do not know if we can. The energy they have gathered is immense, far beyond anything in recorded history. Our colleagues have been attempting to identify the ritual sites, the locations where the breach will be attempted, but the enemy has become adept at concealing their activities. We know it will happen soon, likely within the next year. We know the Pacific Theater is involved, possibly as the primary location. Beyond that, we are operating in darkness." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, discussing strategies, sharing intelligence, coordinating efforts across theaters of operation. But William left with a heaviness that had nothing to do with his infected shoulder. He was being sent back to combat, back to the island-hopping campaign that would eventually reach Japan itself, and he now knew that every battle was not just a military engagement, but a ritual feeding the largest supernatural operation in human history. The Philippines campaign began in October of 1944. William was present at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, where American and Japanese fleets clashed in an engagement that cost tens of thousands of lives over 4 days. He saw the enemy gorge themselves on the souls of sailors, drowning in burning oil, on the terror of men trapped in sinking ships, on the despair of commanders watching their fleets destroyed. He saw the energy channeled away, flowing toward destinations he could now almost perceive, collection points that pulsed with malevolent anticipation. He tried to disrupt what he could, a suggestion planted in the mind of an American admiral, steering his fleet away from an ambush that would have multiplied the casualties, a counter-whisper to a Japanese pilot, breaking the suicidal trance that would have sent him diving into a hospital ship. Small interventions, drops of water against an ocean of blood, but each one mattered. Each soul saved was one less contribution to whatever the enemy was building. The land campaign in the Philippines was worse. The Japanese defenders had been thoroughly infiltrated by enemy influence, their resistance amplified beyond any military logic. Manila, the capital, was defended with a ferocity that resulted in its near-total destruction and the deaths of over 100,000 civilians. William walked through the ruins of the city in March of 1945, sensing the lingering traces of the harvest, the psychic wounds that would take generations to heal if they ever healed at all. It was in Manila that he received the message that changed everything. A Filipino woman approached him in the street, her dress torn, her face streaked with ash and tears from the fires that still burned throughout the city. She spoke in Tagalog, a language William did not understand, but he understood her perfectly because she was not really speaking at all. She was channeling, serving as a conduit for a message from someone who had learned to project across vast distances. The voice that emerged from her mouth was Ishtane's. "We have found it," the old woman's voice said through the young woman's lips. "The primary ritual site. It is in Japan, on an island called Iwo Jima. The enemy will attempt the breach during the American invasion, using the concentrated suffering of the battle as the final fuel for their working. You must go there. You must find the physical anchor of the ritual and destroy it. The fate of everything depends on this." The Filipino woman collapsed as the possession ended, and William caught her before she could hit the rubble-strewn ground. He laid her gently in the shade of a destroyed building and knew that his path was now set. Iwo Jima, the island that would become synonymous with American sacrifice and heroism. The island where the most famous photograph of the war would be taken. That image of Marines raising a flag on a volcanic mountain. the island where the war between frequencies would reach its climax. William arranged his transfer through the network's contacts in military intelligence. By February of 1945, he was aboard a transport ship heading toward the small volcanic island that Japanese propaganda had declared would be defended to the last man. He was accompanied by Thomas Greyfeather, who had volunteered despite wounds that had not fully healed, and by 3 other network operatives whose identities he had only learned in the coded message that confirmed his mission. The bombardment of Iwo Jima began on February 16, 1945. 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing that military planners believed would soften the defenses sufficiently for a rapid conquest. They were wrong. The Japanese had spent months constructing an underground fortress, 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,500 defensive positions, designed to survive anything the Americans could throw at them and exact maximum casualties during the ground assault. William stood on the deck of his transport ship as the island came into view, and he almost staggered from the intensity of what he perceived. Iwo Jima was not merely a battleground. It was a temple. The entire island had been consecrated to the enemy's purpose. Every tunnel and bunker positioned according to patterns that corresponded to geometries visible only on the other frequencies. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the southern end of the island, was the focal point, the location where the breach would be attempted. The Japanese defenders were not merely soldiers. They were sacrifices, willing or otherwise, their deaths pre-planned and their suffering pre-harvested. The enemy had been preparing this moment for years, perhaps decades, manipulating events across the Pacific to ensure that this specific battle would occur at this specific time with this specific intensity. The landing began on February 19th. William went ashore with the third wave, his radio equipment on his back, his rifle in his hands, his perception split between the black sand beach and the frequencies where the real battle was already underway. The first hours were chaos. The Japanese had allowed the initial waves to land before opening fire, ensuring that the beaches would be crowded with targets. Men died around William in numbers that made Saipan look like a skirmish. And above it all, the enemy gathered. William could see them now without effort. Vast shapes that blotted out the sun on frequencies that most humans could never perceive. They were chanting in their wordless way, a vibration that shook reality itself, preparing the breach that would end humanity's dominion over the physical world. William and his team fought their way inland through resistance that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The volcanic sand was so loose that vehicles could not move, and men sank to their knees with every step. The bunkers were invisible until they opened fire, concealed gun slits spitting death from hillsides that appeared empty. The air itself tasted of sulfur, and something worse, the spiritual pollution of a place given over entirely to darkness. It took 4 days to reach the base of Mount Suribachi. By then, William had lost 2 of his 5 team members, good men whose training had not been enough against enemies both physical and otherwise. Thomas Greyfeather was still with him, along with a Choctaw Marine named Samuel Crow, and a woman who used only the name Spider, whose tradition William had never been able to identify, but whose abilities on the frequencies exceeded anyone he had ever encountered. The ascent of Suribachi was a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Japanese had honeycombed the mountain with defensive positions, each one requiring bloody elimination before progress could continue. The famous flag-raising would occur on February 23rd, a moment of triumph for the cameras while the battle continued to rage across the rest of the island. But William's team was not heading for the summit. The entrance to the ritual chamber was hidden in a cave system on the eastern face of the mountain, accessible only through a tunnel that the Japanese had collapsed behind their own defenders. Spider located it using senses that William did not fully understand, and they spent 6 hours clearing rubble while under sporadic sniper fire from positions they could not locate. When they finally broke through, they found themselves in a space that should not have existed. The chamber was enormous, far larger than the geology of the island should have allowed, its walls covered with symbols that predated human civilization. The air was thick with incense and blood, and in the center of the chamber stood an altar constructed from volcanic stone and human bones. On the altar was an object that hurt to look at directly, a sphere of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, pulsing with energy stolen from countless deaths across the Pacific and beyond. The anchor of the ritual, the key to the breach, the thing they had come to destroy. The chamber was not undefended. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the shadows were different from any William had faced before. Their eyes were entirely black, their movements too fluid, their silence too complete. They were not merely influenced by the enemy. They were occupied, their souls pushed aside to make room for entities that now wore their bodies like puppets wear strings. The fight that followed was brutal and brief. Thomas fell first, a bayonet through his chest from a direction he had not anticipated. Samuel Crow died, taking 3 of the possessed with him, his Choctaw war cry echoing through the chamber until it was cut short by a blade across his throat. Spider did something that William's eyes refused to process. A burst of energy on frequencies he could barely perceive, and half the remaining defenders collapsed with blood streaming from their ears and eyes. Then Spider fell too, overwhelmed by numbers that should not have been possible in that confined space. William found himself alone, surrounded by enemies, his rifle empty, his body exhausted, his spirit stretched to the breaking point. The sphere on the altar pulsed faster now, responding to the violence, feeding on the deaths of his friends, growing stronger with each passing second. He had one chance. He closed his eyes and found the still point at the center of his being, the place where his grandmother's songs lived, the foundation that Ishtane had built upon, the core of everything he had become. He sang, not with his physical voice, but with everything he was, every frequency he could reach, every ounce of will he could muster. He sang of dawn, of light returning, of hope that could not be extinguished, of love that transcended death, of faith in something greater than the darkness that surrounded him. He sang of God. The word had never been part of his training. Ishtane had spoken of the Creator in Apache terms, and other teachers had used different names, different frameworks, different theological structures. But in that moment, facing the concentrated evil of millennia, William found that all the names pointed to the same source, the light that opposed the darkness, the love that opposed the hunger, the divine spark that the enemy could never truly extinguish because it was woven into the fabric of existence itself. His song became a prayer. His prayer became a weapon. The sphere on the altar cracked. The enemy screamed on frequencies that shattered reality for 100 miles in every direction. Soldiers on both sides across Iwo Jima fell to their knees, clutching their heads, overwhelmed by a sound they could not hear with their physical ears. The possessed bodies in the chamber collapsed, as the entities inhabiting them were torn away by the backlash of their own failed ritual. And the breach, the doorway that would have ended human sovereignty over the physical world, slammed shut before it could fully open. William Strongbow walked out of that chamber alone. He walked through Japanese defensive positions where the soldiers stared at him with confused eyes, the whispers that had driven them silent for the first time in months. He walked across the black sand beaches where medics were treating men whose wounds had suddenly become less severe, whose minds had suddenly become clearer. He walked until he reached the water's edge, and then he collapsed. He was found by a Marine patrol 3 hours later, unconscious, his hair entirely white, though he was not yet 30 years old. The official record stated that Private First Class William Strongbow had suffered a nervous breakdown due to combat stress and was being evacuated for psychiatric evaluation. The unofficial record, shared only among the network's surviving members, told a different story. The enemy had been stopped, not defeated, never truly defeated, but set back decades in their plans. The energy they had gathered was dispersed, their ritual anchor destroyed, their coordination shattered. They would rebuild, would begin again, would continue their patient cultivation of human suffering. But the breach would not happen today or tomorrow, or within any time frame that the living would need to face. William spent the remainder of the war in a hospital in Hawaii, slowly recovering abilities that had been burned out by his final song. The fighting continued without him. Okinawa fell after 3 months of carnage that made Iwo Jima look merciful. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, generating pulses of suffering so intense that even the diminished enemy managed to feast well. Japan surrendered, and the world celebrated the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. But for William and the remnants of the network, there was no celebration. They knew that the war they fought had no end, only pauses between escalations. They knew that the enemy would adapt, would learn from their failure, would prepare more carefully for the next attempt. They knew that new listeners would need to be found, trained, deployed against threats that the public would never believe existed. William returned to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico in November of 1945. His grandmother had died while he was overseas, but she had left him her house and her journals, pages filled with knowledge that he now understood had been preserved specifically for him. He spent the next 50 years there, training others, maintaining the network, watching for signs of the enemy's return. He never married. He never had children of his own. He said once, in a letter to a fellow survivor, that he had given those possibilities up in the chamber beneath Mount Suribachi, that the price of his final song had been the ability to live a normal life. But he had accepted that price willingly, and he would accept it again if given the choice. William Strongbow died in 1997, at the age of 77. His body was found in his grandmother's house, seated in a chair facing east, a slight smile on his face. The coroner ruled it natural causes. The network knew better. William had simply finished his work and chosen his time to depart. But here is what the official history will never tell you. Here is the secret that has been kept for 8 decades and is only now being revealed. The enemy is still here. They are always here. They did not disappear when William Strongbow destroyed their ritual anchor. They merely retreated, regrouped, began again. Every war since 1945, every genocide, every act of mass cruelty has fed them. They are patient, they are eternal, and they are preparing. Some who have studied the classified documents, the hidden journals, the oral traditions passed down through networks that still exist, believe that another attempt is being planned. The signs are there for those trained to see them. The increase in global conflict, the amplification of hatred and division, the systematic erosion of the traditions and beliefs that once protected human consciousness from the whispers. The listeners are still out there, scattered across the world, watching and waiting. The descendants of the Apache code talkers, the inheritors of traditions stretching back to the dawn of humanity. They train in secret. They recruit those who carry the mark. They prepare for the day when they will be needed again. And if you are watching this video, if something in these words has resonated with a part of you that you have never been able to explain, if you have always felt that the world is not quite what it seems, that shadows move in ways they should not, that whispers sometimes come from places that have no mouths, then perhaps you are one of them. Perhaps the mark is on you, waiting to be recognized. The war is not over. It has never been over. It will not be over until the last human consciousness flickers out, or until something fundamental changes in the nature of existence itself. But there is hope. There has always been hope. William Strongbow found it in the darkest moment of his life, in a chamber built for humanity's destruction. He found it in a song, in a prayer, in a faith that transcended all the boundaries that humans have erected between themselves and the divine. That hope is still available. That light still shines. No matter how dark the night becomes, no matter how loud the whispers grow, no matter how overwhelming the enemy seems, the dawn always returns. Because there is a God who loves his creation. Because there is a Christ who conquered death itself. Because the darkness, for all its age and power, is ultimately a temporary condition, a shadow that will fade when the true light finally breaks through. If you have felt the call, answer it. If you have seen the signs, do not ignore them. If you have heard the whispers, learn to recognize them for what they are, and learn the songs that silence them. The Apache code talkers saved the world once, in ways that history will never record. Their legacy continues in every soul that chooses light over darkness, hope over despair, love over hatred. And that legacy can continue in you. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Tell others what you have learned. Because knowledge is its own form of protection, and every mind awakened is one more soldier in the war that has no end. The enemy is watching, but so is something far greater. May God protect you. May Christ guide you. May the light that William Strongbow found beneath Mount Suribachi illuminate your path through whatever darkness lies ahead. The war continues, but you do not have to face it alone.